Yeah, thank you for having me here today. It's been a chance for me to really take a dive into U.S. Clyvar and understanding some of the great work that you all do. Um, but today I'm going to talk a bit about seaweed, and as a physical oceanographer, it's kind of an interesting thing to talk about seaweed. But hopefully, I think one of the things I'd like to communicate today is what an interesting problem this is, even for someone who likes to think about physics. Well, truthfully, I do a lot of the work that I do is really on the line of physics and understanding its effects on biological systems. So seaweed in particular is a really interesting organism in that it responds quite a bit to physical flow in its growth, but also they are, kelps especially are ecosystem engineers in coastal ecosystems that support them and really can modify the flow. It turns out to be a pretty challenging flow problem, hydrodynamics problem, which makes it, of course, kind of fun to try to tackle. So today, I'm going to talk about some work that we've been doing for, my group has been doing for about 7 years now. And this is on aspects of seaweed cultivation. This work was originally funded by the Department of Energy's ARPA-E, but has since, this project has kind of expanded in a couple of ways. So seaweed has been typically there hasn't been a lot of seaweed cultivation in the US. Most of seaweed cultivation has happened in Asia, but seaweed cultivation in US waters is growing rapidly, primarily in Maine and in Alaska. And people are excited about seaweed cultivation for a couple of reasons. It represents sort of this regenerative form of aquaculture. It's thought that to be quite a sustainable form of aquaculture that is able to potentially take up excess nutrients, land-derived nutrients, anthropogenic nutrients that are flowing into our coastal zones, driving harmful algal blooms and other problems, and is also a sustainable source of food. And in some of the lucrative seaweed crops like abalone and things like that are actually consume seaweed, and so they can, seaweed can also be food for other things that we care about. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. But additionally, over the past 5 to or so years, people have gotten really excited about seaweed as a potential strategy for carbon dioxide removal. And the reasons for that are that seaweed grows very, very fast. Growth rates are more than an order of magnitude faster than terrestrial trees, which if you go buy a plane ticket, you can offset your emissions by often contributing to forests in different places. So seaweed grows quite a bit faster. It has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than phytoplankton. So Redfield ratio for phytoplankton, that's a little over 6, but for seaweed, carbon to nitrogen ranges from 10 to 30 even under certain conditions, and dependent on the different species, the season, and the nutrient status of the seaweed. And so there's been a lot of exploration of whether we could grow seaweed in farms in coastal waters or farther offshore, harvest the biomass from the seaweed that's taking up inorganic carbon, pack it together and intentionally sink it offshore. So that's one strategy, is the intentional sinking of seaweed biomass into deep areas of the ocean to essentially remove that carbon from the fast cycling in the upper ocean. Some other strategies that have been discussed and some tried are to seed, temporary rafts that are floating with seaweed spores so that they will grow and sink over time. Excuse me. Or to assist the sinking of large naturally occurring rafts of seaweed, such as sargassum, to assist their sinking so that they don't end up on a coastline causing trouble, and that you also help some of that carbon into the deep ocean. So we'll talk about some of these strategies, but another class of thinking about seaweed dynamics is in thinking about the blue carbon, restoration of seaweed ecosystems near shore. So naturally occurring ecosystems that have been degraded over time due to ocean change or other coastal management or lack of, is strategies to restore seaweed ecosystems to try to add some carbon cycling there. The trouble with the strategies for using seaweed as a carbon dioxide removal is that you really have to think carefully about the fate of that carbon. Because unlike a tree, a terrestrial tree, where the carbon is locked for a long time, on the order of 100 years or so, in that biomass or transferred through roots into the ground, seaweed does not operate in the same way that a tree does. There's a fast, the flux of carbon in is fast as it's growing. It's got a really fast growth rate, but seasonally that biomass that's in that tissue doesn't have roots like a tree does. It's just got a holdfast that's holding it to the bottom, and it's not transporting that carbon anywhere. It's in the biomass, or it is released as dissolved organic carbon or particulate organic carbon as blades and things break off and transported in ocean currents. And so we really have to think carefully about the fate of that biomass and the dissolved carbon compounds that come from seaweed if we want to understand the ability of seaweed to contribute to carbon dioxide removal. And that, as you all well know, is a challenging thing in the oceans, to really understand the transport of things in the oceans and their ultimate fate. We have to, make some really challenging observations and use models to help us get a sense of that. Okay, so, essentially this is a figure that I've adapted and borrowed from Dave Siegel to really think about a hypothetical carbon budget for a seaweed farm. And essentially of the net primary productivity in, say, a seaweed farm in this green box, essentially through DOC loss and chemical sequestration, so refractory DOC compounds that are not easily used by other organisms, or through, if you imagine that you just take all of that biomass that you've harvested and quickly convey it to the seafloor, you can capture, theoretically, about 70% of the carbon that is fixed in the biomass. So that's a pretty large percentage. However, that ignores, once it gets to the bed, we have to think next about what's going to happen to that biomass. How is it going to break down over time? And where is that carbon going to be transported? And then, of course, what sort of implications are there for those deep benthic ecosystems? These are all really important questions that we have to answer if we want to consider seaweed. And if you, essentially, well, I guess we'll get to it on this slide. I'm going to put a couple of the conclusions up front, and we'll revisit this, and I'll sort of show you how we got to some of these as we go through the talk. But essentially, through modeling studies, we've shown that it is possible to grow a lot of seaweed in the world's oceans, to make a meaningful contribution to the fixing of large amounts of greater than a gigaton of CO2 a year of dissolved organic carbon, equivalent of a gigaton of CO2 a year, dissolved organic carbon in the upper ocean through seaweed growth in the most productive areas of the ocean. However, this study was really just about the feasibility of fixing that carbon, not the durability of that carbon capture or the implications for the deep ecosystems, or the redistribution, the long-term redistribution of nutrients in the ocean if you were to go after growing seaweed at scale, and consequences for phytoplankton productivity globally. So this is sort of a first, back of the envelope estimate of could we grow enough seaweed to reach some meaningful contribution to the amount of carbon dioxide removal that we are targeting globally. So we have some really important unanswered fundamental questions about still about the carbon pathways associated with seaweed farming and sinking, and most of those involve the dissolved organic pool of carbon that I was talking about. Seaweeds, if you've ever picked up a bunch of seaweed that's washed up on shore, the rack, sometimes you can feel that it has this kind of slime. Seaweed is always exuding, releasing some of the nutrients, both carbon and nitrogen and other things that it's taken up. And there's a lot of thought by seaweed physiologists why this is, but essentially some theories are about keeping fouling organisms from occupying the seaweed too much. But a lot of that carbon is released. Some of those dissolved organic compounds are thought to be hard to break down, and so some of that carbon is essentially chemically sequestered in these refractory compounds. And so we need to understand more about that. We do not understand enough about that pathway. But our study essentially showed that it was both a feasibility of growing large amounts of seaweed, but also a techno-economic analysis of how much would it cost to grow seaweed in different parts of the ocean. And essentially concluded that potentially using seaweed in place of emissions-intensive agricultural products like human food or animal feed was a more cost-effective way of essentially, a climate mitigation than sinking large amounts of seaweed to the bottom of the ocean. And this is even before we think about environmental considerations of what that large amount of biomass is, potentially how it's changing those benthic ecosystems at depth. Okay, so as part of this project that was originally funded by ARPA-E, my group developed this macroalgae cultivation modeling system, MacMods, and it was really a modeling system that was intended to answer questions at a range of different scales. Some of the first questions that we wanted to address as part of this project was to evaluate offshore seaweed farm designs. And I'm talking about how deep should your lines be to grow your seaweed? What's the spacing between lines? What orientation should the lines be relative to the flow? These are questions that we were addressing in partnership with other groups who were actually designing and building farms that would be tested offshore in US waters for growing seaweed. And to do this, we really needed to, achieve spatial scales that would allow us to resolve, distances between lines and individual kelp. The first farms we were working on were Macrocystis porifera, so giant kelp farms. And so the spatial scales are on the order of meters to a kilometer, which is about the size of a farm unit. Excuse me. And the time scales were on the order of a growth season, so a season of growth, to time scales for turbulent mixing, so on the order of a second. There were also other questions that that were larger scale, such as where would you choose to site a farm? What oceanographic conditions might favor good growth on a given shelf? And so this was an example of where we were applying the model to a shelf scale questions. And so we needed to, think about things at larger scales and longer time scales. Not just one growth season, but what would the conditions at this site be over, say, a decade? And then, of course, we already talked a little bit about why we're interested in thinking about global scales for seaweed cultivation, assessing the potential of seaweed to contribute to carbon dioxide removal. There are a lot of other questions in here, but these are kind of the ones that I'll address today. Fortunately, as part of this big RBE project, we were able to work directly with seaweed farmers who were also part of this big project, who were growing different species of seaweed, some tropical, some temperate, some tropical. You'll see pictures of these tropical species here. This is Yukiuma. This is Loretta Robertson at Marine Biological Labs. And then these are some very baby macrocystis on lines in California. And we also worked with farm Ocean Era in Hawaii, who are growing some native Hawaiian seaweed species. These partnerships allowed us to make sure that the model was answering some useful questions for the seaweed seaweed farmers, but also they were collecting data, and we helped to collect data on their farms that could be used for model validation. Okay, so the first version of this model, this MacMods model, was essentially a macroalgal growth model that was offline coupled to a regional ocean modeling system with so physical and biogeochemical model of the US West Coast. And as I mentioned, that we were really interested in really getting down to within farm scale hydrodynamics and growth dynamics. And so not only did we have the regional ocean model, but we had a large eddy simulation model of the farm canopy itself to really be able to resolve things such as, the modification of flow within the farm, the shear-driven turbulent transport of deep waters beneath the farm into the farm canopy, the stagnation of flow within the farm canopy, because as I said, the growth of seaweed is dependent on flow. The drawdown of nutrients within the farm canopy as the flow is going through, and the attenuation of light, not only by, whatever might be attenuating light within the water column, phytoplankton, some other aspects of turbidity, but also self-shading by the canopy itself. So if you're trying to push the limits of productivity of a farm system, then you need to be able to really understand the flow within a dense canopy, and that's a fun hydrodynamic problem. So the details of this model system are in this paper that I would encourage you to check out. But essentially, I think you all probably are familiar with most forms of regional ocean models and a fine scale hydrodynamic model. But this macroalgal growth model was a dynamic growth model in that growth is limited by nutrients, light, temperature, and currents and waves. So waves both enhance nutrient uptake in this model, but also appear in the mortality term, in the loss term, as an erosive factor that when the wave, significant wave height is higher, it will increase the mortality term and will lose some of the biomass due to wave loss. In this model, this version of the model is frond resolving. We were tracking every frond on every kelp plant within this model, and also there were age-dependent growth and mortality processes. So this is a simulation. The first simulation was of a farm with one of our farm partners, Ocean Rainforest, off of Santa Barbara, about 5 miles offshore. They were growing Macrocystis porifera. And this is a top-down view of flow. Flow is going from left to right here in a hypothetical farm where biomass is planted along these long lines at 20 meters depth. And flow is, you can see, these are a slice of LES results through the farm where you have slower flow in the blues along the long lines and flows accelerating between the lines. I'll sort that again. And you can see evidence of these sort of turbulent structures in the downstream. And so this immediately sort of suggests that circulation within the farm and within the canopy is governed by turbulent flow. And we get some interesting structures that form within the canopy. Essentially, the features of this flow are that, of course, you get this drag along the long lines, acceleration between. At the base of the farm, you get this sheared profile because you have drag in your suspended canopy and free-flowing fluid underneath that tends to transport deep fluid up into the farm. So that's a passive way of entraining fluid through this sheared flow beneath the farm. And also one of the more interesting results of the computational, the model is that you form these attached Langmuir type eddies that tend to upwell water within the canopy and downwell in between. And so, you essentially get upwelling along each of these lines because of this sort of discontinuous drag formation. And so this was exciting because it allows us to think about ways you can arrange your roughness to passively entrain deep water and essentially fertilize the farm from beneath. So these are results that are in this paper here in JFM. But of course, that's a idealized kelp farm. The kelp in that experiment idealized numerical experiment were extremely well behaved. They didn't flap around and get tangled with each other. And so we really, of course, needed to get out to a real farm to take observations and to validate these model results. And so these are some pictures of us out in the field off of Santa Barbara on the ocean rainforest kelp farm, taking upstream. So here's the farm. It's anchored at the bottom in about 70 meters of water. And then these are the long lines with kelp growing on some of these vertical lines. Here's some of the kelp on the farm. We had upstream, downstream wire walkers and static moorings, lots of sensors within the farm, and taking observations for model validation. Unfortunately, this year in particular was not a very great year for the farm. It was frankly their first attempt growing in this site. And so I think they had some things to learn about how to plant out these kelp spores on long lines offshore. But we were able to repeat this experiment actually at another farm that they have in the Faroe Islands this past summer, where they're growing a different kind of kelp called saccharina, sugar kelp. And they have a lot more experience growing kelp here. They've been growing it there for over a decade. So instead of being floaty like Macrocystis, saccharina hang down from long lines near the surface, but they had a very good crop that year. And we did a lot of observations of flow and turbulent mixing within the canopy. And so those results are forthcoming. But essentially, we're using these the MacMod's output to help our farmers make decisions about things like when to plant out their seeds. So these are 3 different simulations of canopy biomass seeding out in November, January, or March of a given year. And you can see this is a simulation for that farm off of California. And you can see that, if you seed out in November versus January, you get this sort of delayed biomass, but there's not a big difference in the amount of biomass you would get over the year. However, if you wait to get your your lines seeded in March, then you've missed, of course, the nice upwelling window on the West Coast, and your canopy does not get the amount of nutrients that it needs to grow. And so we can use our model to help guide cultivation practices. Here's another example of the trade-offs between having your long lines near the surface where they might get light versus planting them a little deeper so that they get higher concentrations of nutrients, and sort of trade-offs in cultivation depth. And then also we can use the model to look at different harvesting techniques over the year to maximize annual biomass at the end of the year. How many times do you want to harvest? When do you want to harvest? And so these were capabilities that were really useful for our farm partners. Excuse me. So at the shelf scale, we're using this model to really think about strategies for siting seaweed farms. In fact, one of the areas that we've been working in the Gulf of Mexico, as you all well know, is it's a region of the ocean with a lot of infrastructure, existing infrastructure. In fact, these are some NOAA maps of energy infrastructure, pipelines, and a lot of infrastructure in New Mexico. In this bottom plot here, we've overlain, kind of put all of that infrastructure in white, but also taken a look at where you might grow seaweed if you wanted to grow seaweed in the Gulf of Mexico. And then the point of this project is to think about, could we put seaweed farms such that they would take up nutrients from the Mississippi and Atchafalaya river plumes, and fix that the nitrogen before it drives eutrophication and low oxygen zones downstream. And so this is just, again, kind of a hypothetical problem, thinking about using seaweed cultivation to soak up anthropogenic nutrients as a way of bioremediation of our coastal waters. So this is ongoing. Here we're using ocean inputs from Copernicus to drive the macroalgal growth model, the MacMods model. We've also been working with the Department of Energy to, they put out a report every few years to summarize the potential of sustainable biofuels and bioproducts. And this was the 2023 billion ton, that's called the billion ton report. The 2023 billion ton report, it's billion tons of feedstocks for biofuels. So the 2023 report was the first one that included macroalgae biomass for the first time. And of course, we're not creating a lot of macroalgae biomass, so it was the potential for macroalgae biomass as assessed by the MacMods model. And so you can see reds indicate a high potential for seaweed biomass yield, and that's in primarily in coastal Alaska and Maine, which is in fact where seaweed cultivation is taking off. And then finally, at the global scale, we're using MacMods to assess the potential for seaweed-based carbon dioxide sequestration. And I've already tipped my hat on my feelings on this potential already, which is theoretically we can grow a lot of seaweed. However, I think there are a lot of drawbacks and questions that we're using seaweed, cultivation in this way. But what we did to address this question was first to evaluate the potential, how much seaweed can be grown. Excuse me. This was a project carried out by a former postdoc who's now assistant professor at UCLA, Isabella Arzeno Soltero, who used the MacMods model to assess the potential for growing seaweed globally, looking at some different nutrient assumptions in the ability of seaweed to compete with phytoplankton for nutrients, and essentially the results showed that we could grow a lot of seaweed. However, what you assume about the competition of seaweed and phytoplankton makes a big difference to the results. And so we needed a fully coupled model. And some groups have already been working on this question a bit more than we have. So we can grow a whole lot of carbon in seaweed, or we can, pack a lot of carbon in seaweed, but how much does it cost to grow it? And what is it worth? So thinking about the economic side, this was a project, a TEA, a techno-economic analysis by a graduate student, Dr. Julianne D'Angelo, where she looked at the cost of growing seaweed in different parts of the oceans, the capital cost, how much would it cost to get it to port if you wanted to turn it into a product, if you wanted to sink it, how far would you need to transport it to the deepest, nearest part of the ocean to sink it? What fraction of that would be sequestered? What fraction of that would actually come out of the atmosphere? What are the costs of converting that biomass to some other product, like a biofuel, like a food, like an animal feed? And then what is the value of that product? And so, in thinking about some different uses for seaweed, such as here, this is, sinking seaweed in different places. If you grow it in different places in the ocean, this is turning it into the cost to turn it into food. So here we have the cost. This is the global lowest cost, the lowest 1% of cost. So, assuming you would do it first where it is cheapest, $540 per ton of CO2. And that is much higher than some other strategies right now, but not a completely ridiculous cost, especially if you consider that in the future you'll have some learning rates that will bring that cost down. However, it's much more competitive to use that biomass to replace high greenhouse gas intensive forms of food, so $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent, or to turn it into animal feed, and even more efficient, more lucrative to turn it into a biofuel, where you are avoiding greenhouse gases rather than sequestering carbon with it. So the conclusion here was that at this time, our estimate, our work suggests that there are more efficient things economically to do with seaweed biomass than to sink it into the ocean. And some of these results, if you're interested, are available for playing around with our model and some of the results, changing some of our assumptions on this Carbon Plan website that has a sort of an interactive version of our model that you can change different aspects of the results and see what it means in different parts of the ocean. Okay, there we go. So coming back to these conclusions again, can kelp play a role in can seaweed play a role in our, climate mitigation? Theoretically, yes. But we have a lot of unanswered questions, and sinking seaweed is probably not the best thing to do with that biomass from our estimations. That said, there are a lot of other reasons to be interested in seaweed cultivation. As we mentioned at the beginning, there are, it's a sustainable form of aquaculture that can provide a valuable source of food and feed, and can revitalize, working coastlines, and there are a lot of reasons to be interested in seaweed besides carbon sequestration. So that's it. Happy to take questions.
Thanks for a fabulous talk. I was wondering, you had this awesome process level LES stuff and upwelling. I was wondering how you export those to the regional scale. Like, did you develop parameterizations along the way? How do you get to those larger scales?
Yeah, no, that is a really interesting question. Um, so really, we have been, kind of converging on scales as, so we've been working with Jim McWilliams, Daniel Dalhare, and others. So Daniel is now at UCSB, and Jim McWilliams is still at UCLA. But essentially, they were part of this project, and um, we were essentially pulling the resolution of ROMs down and down and down. We started with a kilometer scale ROMs, and then a 300-meter scale ROMs, and a 20-meter scale ROMs, resolution. And so really, directly comparing both the flow fields and the turbulent fields from the LES and the ROMs, and turning knobs on ROMs, to try to match the kinds of mixing and circulation that we see. And of course, it's not perfect. We are really, we get down to how we represent the canopy drag. We're not going to be able to answer some of those really fine scale questions like farm design with ROMs, even, a highly resolved ROMs. However, we can, you know, excuse me, potentially use the fine scale ROMs to think about shelf scale implications for farm placement, farm arrangement, changing flow on the shelf with increasing numbers of farms on the shelf. And so it really is about, just getting the scales close enough that those parameterizations are possible. We're not there yet, though. That's still, we don't have the fully coupled fine scale ROMs running yet that is running multiple farms. So that's still something that we aspire to do.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Up next, we have Kurt.
Thanks for the fabulous talk, Kristen. 20-meter ROMs, that's impressive.
Yeah.
So you have this map showing the cost per gigaton CO2 removed. I noticed there's a large geographic variability. Subtropical gyres looks like higher cost, right? So what factors contributed to this map? Like why some regions have a lower cost in comparison to others? Temperature upwelling and nutrient availability, things like that. Can you speak more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So here, I think the first map to look at is where seaweed would be able to grow. So that's the first thing that went into those later maps is how much biomass can you produce in these different areas of the ocean. And so to understand that here, we seeded essentially in every grid cell in the ocean all of these different types of seaweed. So we had 4 types of seaweed: temperate red, temperate brown, tropical red, tropical brown. So pretty broad groups, but they capture some of the most cultivated species in the world, and the ones that would do decently well in offshore environments. One that you might sort of, if you know much about seaweed, is missing here are the greens, like ulva, but they're not very easy to cultivate in the open ocean, so we haven't included them here. And essentially, we've picked the group of seaweed that grows the best in a given cell in the ocean, and we've assumed that that's what you would grow if you were going to grow seaweed there. And so then you can, and down here you can see the different types of seaweed that would grow in different parts of the ocean. So in the equatorial regions, we have tropical reds, shifting to temperate reds, and browns along as you go towards the poles. So once you have that, then you can think about, okay, in a given grid cell, how much would it cost given, and this is dependent on wave conditions, ocean conditions, how much would it cost to, keep how do the capital costs change with ocean conditions and the depth of the water? It's more expensive to anchor a farm in very deep water. We're going with typical farm designs here. Some people have been talking about floating farm designs. We stuck with some, more practiced, state-of-the-art right now farm designs. And then once you have your, if you're farther away from a port, then maintenance costs and harvesting costs go up because you have to get your boats out to your farm. Labor to put people on those boats takes is more costly, and so then and if you have to harvest and get that biomass back, then that's included, that transportation cost. And so some of the parts of the ocean that you see here, the costs are a little different because there might be a port on some islands nearby that we're going to. So we only considered major ports, but some of those are not easy to see on this map. There's less structure for sinking seaweed because you don't always have to get you don't bring your seaweed back to port in that case. You are transporting it to, there's essentially an algorithm that's looking for the nearest, deepest basin to sink seaweed in this case, to your growing location. Right. So that might explain some of the variability in why.
I see.
Cost.
Yeah. Interesting stuff. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. I think we have time for one more question, and it's Gail.
Hey, nice talk. I was just wondering about, it's the first time that I hear people contemplate the idea of doing this in the international waters. I thought that, folks who do aquaculture, they do it in their exclusive economic zone because otherwise you cannot guarantee anything. So is there like people are really realistically talking about doing this in international waters?
No. So this is, as I said, sort of this is the back of the envelope, theoretical. How much could we grow if we were going to grow it everywhere? And then where would we grow it? This estimate, however, that we would be able to grow a greater than a gigaton of seaweed carbon per year is restricted to global exclusive economic zones. So, in this estimate, we sort of integrated the biomass in only within exclusive economic zones in order to, be more realistic, given, your comment that no, the first place that you grow this would not be in international waters. But the attempt was really just to see what would grow where, and figure out where would you grow seaweed if you could grow it everywhere. And then, so but we can grow a lot of seaweed in the most productive EEZs. This gigaton is going to require farming over 1 million square kilometers of the most productive EEZs, including, for example, things like the Galapagos, which is not a place that we would want to fill with seaweed farms. So this is very much a, theoretical exercise, not that we're proponents of growing seaweed everywhere.
So if I can, just a quick follow-up on that. I heard before a talk, somebody telling me that this was for seaweed kelp farms, that if we were to make this to scale to anything that makes a dent, like a 1% reduction in total CO2 emission, it corresponded to something like 1,000-kilometer band around the entire US, continental US. Is that
1,000 kilometers? I don't believe that sounds too big.
Okay.
But this is a huge number. I think that what that person was trying to say probably is it is a massive area, and it is indeed a massive area. This is on the order of the size of I think it's like half of California. So think about the amount of agriculture in California and expanding our cultivation of seaweed to something like that. That's a huge scale up. That's a huge presence in the oceans. And so the scale of this sort of effort is indeed massive.